Our scripture this morning is one of my favorites, the story of Esther. Now, I have put in little pieces of the story of Esther because I thought sure you didn't want me to come up here and read the whole book of Esther to you. But I encourage you, when you get a chance, to go and read it because her story is amazing and wonderful, and I want to share it with you today and see how God is speaking to us through Esther's story. So we will start with chapter 7, verses 1 to 6, and verses 9 and 10, and then move to chapter 9 for verses 20 to 22. So the king and Haman went into the feast with Queen Esther. On the second day, as they were drinking wine, the king said to Esther, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even up to half my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled." Then Queen Esther said, "If I have won your favor, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given to me. That is my petition, and the lives of my people. That is my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have held my peace. But no enemy can compensate for this damage to the king." Then the king said to Esther, "Who is he, and where is he, and who has presumed to do this?" Esther said, "A foe and enemy, this wicked Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, "Look, the very gallows that Haman had prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, stands at Haman's house, 50 cubits high." And the king said, "Hang him on that." So they hanged Haman on the gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the anger of the king was abated. Mordecai recorded these things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of the king, both near and far, enjoining them that they should keep the 14th day of the month, Adar, and also the 15th day of the same month, year by year, as the days on which the Jews gained relief from their enemies, and as the month that had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness, from mourning into a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food to one another and presents to the poor. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So if that didn't fully make sense, I'll fill in some of the blanks for you. Today's scripture is about an amazing woman named Esther. She was incredible. Do you know her story? Maybe you've heard the phrase, "for such a time as this." That is from Esther's story. In my opinion, we don't tell her story quite often enough. Many of us probably heard it in Sunday school class as kids or children's church, and may not have done much else with it. Yet Esther's story has so much to teach us about holding on to what is right, to do the good thing even when it's difficult or terrifying, because she did just that. Let's take a journey back to 483 BC, so a long time ago. And we are in the land of Persia. And there lived a community of Jews, of God's people, who had been moved far away from their homes because of war. And they had lived in this new place for a while, and in some ways it was becoming home. But in other ways, they were constantly reminded that they were the outsiders. At this time, Persia had a king who was the final authority on everything. What he said across the king. He made the rules and no one argued with him. In fact, one day the king called for his queen to come show off her beauty at a banquet, and she didn't come. And the next thing people knew, the king was searching for a new queen. And as to the old queen, no one exactly knows what happened to her. So this king was not someone to mess with. So the search for a new queen began. And the king, his main requirement was that he wanted someone beautiful. The woman didn't have to be rich or from a royal family, just beautiful. And the king found Esther, who was one of the Jewish people in Persia, to be the most beautiful of all the women he saw. So he made Esther queen. Esther didn't tell anyone about her family or who her people were. Her parents had died when she was young, and her older cousin Mordecai had raised her. Mordecai had told her not to tell anyone, and Mordecai was a good man. He was honest and he was brave. He even overheard two of the king's officers devising a plan to kill the king. So Mordecai told Queen Esther to warn the king. And then Mordecai's name was written on the king's log so his help could be remembered forever. But not everyone liked Mordecai. The king's top advisor that we heard about earlier, Haman, thought he himself should be honored and treated special. Haman wanted people to physically bow down and praise the king like he was God. Well, Mordecai would not do it. He said the only one he would bow down and praise would be God. Well, Haman was embarrassed and furious that Mordecai ignored him. Thus, he wanted revenge. So Haman convinced the king in vague details that the Jews were a threat to the kingdom and should be put to death. And the king signed off on the order for all the Jews to be killed on a particular day to come. And it wasn't a secret. They knew about it. They knew what was coming. Word got around to people, and they were terrified. So Mordecai went to Esther, and he said, "You're the queen. You're the queen. You've got to talk to the king about our people. You've got to try to save us." And at first, Esther really wasn't having it. She told him, "You don't just approach the king. You have to be invited. This could go really terribly. I don't want to do this." Because if you didn't listen to the king or crossed him, you could end up like the last queen, and she didn't want that to happen. Yet Mordecai kept encouraging Esther. He kept telling her, "But remember who you are. What about your people?" Mordecai encouraged Esther to follow God's call and to be brave. He tells her, "People may not know that you are Jewish. The king may not know. But think about everyone else. Your family, your friends, your people. What if you were made queen for such a time as this?" Then she makes the decision. She follows the call, and Esther tells Mordecai to have everyone in the community fast and pray for her. "I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish," Esther says. For such a time as this, knowing what could happen to her, knowing that it was against the law and she could be hurt if this did not go well, Esther invites the king and Haman to a banquet. Haman saw Mordecai at the king's gates, and Mordecai didn't seem afraid at all. This infuriated Haman, so he set up a giant pole and was planning to ask the king to have Mordecai impaled on king didn't know this and wanted to honor Mordecai for helping him earlier. The banquet time comes, and they have wine, and the king asks, Esther, what is your request? It will be given to you, up to half the kingdom. My friends, in that moment, Esther could have asked anything. She could have asked anything. And yet she says, if it pleases you, let me live. This is what I ask, and let my people live too. This is what I want. I ask this because my people have been sold and destroyed, to be destroyed. We are to be killed and wiped out. And then the king asked, Who's trying to do this? Well, Haman, your advisor, who's pretty wicked. The king was shocked at this revelation. He didn't know Esther or Mordecai were Jewish. He favored them and appreciated them. He didn't want to hurt them. And more than that, he was surprised that his top advisor had betrayed him and deceived him, calling for innocent people to be killed. The king decreed that all Jews would be saved, and Haman, well, the story doesn't end well for him. But Esther here is so amazing because with the prayers and encouragement of Mordecai and her people, she followed God's call. She took a risk that could have killed her in order to save her people. Even to this day, the Jewish people have a feast and celebrate Esther's work at a festival every year. My friends, I told you this whole story today to bring up this point. Esther could have asked anything. She was beautiful. She was favored by the king. She could have said, forget everyone else. I'm just going to save myself and get up to half the kingdom. She could have been selfish, but she wasn't. She chose to be brave, to do the right thing, to follow God's call. So she asks for mercy. What's interesting here in the story of Esther is that God never speaks in the book of Esther, at least in an audible voice. God doesn't say, Esther, do this, I'm telling you right now. Yet we see God working through faithful people. Mordecai knows the Jews are going to be killed, and he gives Esther amazing wisdom and guidance because he believed in the promises of God. And he believed in God's call on Esther's life, that maybe she was queen for such a time as this. And she was made to be queen, to be brave, and to ask for mercy. And she did it. She did it. She followed God's call. So the question now is, will you? Now I know you're probably thinking, okay, Pastor Anna, that's a big jump. I don't have a whole community of people asking me to save their lives right now. Okay, I get that. However, God is calling us all to something. And maybe you're thinking, I haven't heard God's voice in my life. But let's take a moment to see if that's true. Maybe you haven't heard the audible voice of God. But have you heard the voice of God from the people around you? Offering you wisdom, uplifting you, praying for you, guiding you? That's what Esther did. This beautiful, brave story of Esther reminds us to follow God's call, even when it's hard, whatever it may be. Part of your call may be making the amazing crafts for Bazaar. Maybe it's making the delicious brisket that we served and sold out of yesterday. Maybe it's greeting people and encouraging them. brave or start a new adventure or make a hard decision. God's call doesn't have to be this huge life-saving event like Esther's was. But still, God is calling you to something good. Maybe you're thinking, I have no idea what in the world God would be calling me to do. That's okay. That's honest. I would say, then start small. Start listening. Or listening more. Do good for others. Be as selfless as you can be. Help people. Act on the virtues of God and the fruits of the Spirit. Follow what Jesus did. Pray. Because God will do the rest. Pray and hope and trust in God that God will lead you where you need to be. Because what if maybe you were called for such a time as this? Amen.